Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for being here and for continuing with the YouTube rabbit hole that led you to this video at 3 in the morning. My name is Jean, and today I'll be talking about the role of print in Renaissance culture. So this is a lecture that I wrote and delivered about 2 years ago when I was an undergrad teaching assistant for an upper level history class about the Renaissance. I've updated the information based on feedback from my supervising professor at the time, but of course, I am no expert on this subject. One of my bachelor's degrees is in history, and I do intend to go to grad school for roughly this same topic, but as of this recording, like I said, I am no expert. So I'll be including a bibliography at the end of this video, but if you have any questions on how I obtained any of this information, I encourage you to drop a comment below and I'll get back to you, or even better yet, do your own research because research is fun. So let's go ahead and get started. Elizabeth Eisenstein, a late intellectual historian, referred to the advent of Gutenberg's printing press and its effects as the printing revolution. Although contested by other scholars, her decision to use the term revolution does have merit. Some things were simply never the same after the press came into use. The press really did seem to touch every aspect of early modern European society. The short and long-term effects of the printing press should not be understated and deserve much more consideration than I have the time to give today. But in a nutshell, the press rapidly increased the availability of books, disseminated knowledge to a previously unseen degree, diversified the literary canon, increased literacy, inspired new communication, changed educational methods, strengthened the vernacular, aided scholastic disciplines, advertised the accumulation of goods. The list goes on and on. Although profound in its own right, the printing press is more properly understood as the next step of the intellectual transformation that was already taking place within the time that preceded it. So, in order to better grasp the role that the printing press played in Renaissance culture, it's necessary to understand the preceding world of publication, which was going through what one historian called a, quote, scribal renaissance, end quote, of its own. So prior to the printing press, contemporary and historical texts were composed as manuscripts. This is when I asked the class if anyone knew Latin, because manuscript essentially means written by hand. Manu is Latin for hand, and scriptus is essentially written by or to write. And scribes would either copy what was being dictated to them orally, or they would copy an existing text that was in front of them. And these texts were primarily copied on parchment till the introduction of paper in the late Middle Ages. So you probably have more books on your nightstand than one scribe could produce in an entire year. On an average workday, which was considerably less time than our average workday, coming in at about 3 hours, scribes would only be able to copy around 200 lines. Depending on the size of the codex, 200 lines would make up just about 2 to 3 pages. The average scribe would be able to produce just about 2 books a year, but some texts, such as those beautiful illuminated Bibles, could take well over a year to complete. So due to the time and money it took to produce books, they were certainly not commonplace. And because of the sheer rarity of them, the value of these books was very high. So unsurprisingly, medieval thieves recognized the value of these manuscripts, which prompted monastic libraries to implement security measures to protect their collections, such as physically restraining the manuscripts to the shelves. The Hereford Cathedral in England, which is on the left up here, has the largest chain library with over 200 manuscripts. So as you can see, the chain was attached from the front end of the book to the rod at the bottom of the shelf. Readers were able to sit at the desk with the text, but alas, they could go no further with them. This is one of my favorite parts of book history. So some scribes would include a personal note to readers at the beginning of the book, basically prescribing harm to anyone that tried to steal it. So on the right here is one particular book curse or inscription on a Bible copied in 1172, and this reads, "If anyone take away this book, let him die the death. Let him be fried in a pan. Let the falling sickness and fever seize him. Let him be broken on the wheel and hanged. Amen." I don't know about you, but I kind of want to write that in all my books now. Clearly, this was an extremely laborious and expensive process, which limited manuscript clientele. In the early Middle Ages, manuscript production was a strictly religious undertaking. Monasteries had a designated room called the scriptorium, where scribes and illuminators would gather to produce didactic religious texts, including those just of scripture and texts for service. A new book about the scriptorium came out in October of this year called The Medieval Scriptorium by Sarah J. Charles. I have not read it myself, but I've heard really, really good things about it. And I'm hoping to read it soon, so I would recommend starting there for more information. This religious yoke on manuscript production began to dissipate in the 12th century for at least two glaring reasons. Number one being the expansion of universities. So, as universities began to get established in cities such as Paris, Oxford, Padua, Siena, Bologna, which is where Petrarch studied, there was an increasing demand in texts that were independent from the church. The University of Paris is especially a case in chief, as they offered one of the largest selections of disciplines during the time. Their studies were subdivided under law, medicine, theology, and the arts. So it's no surprise that all four of these areas required a great number of diverse textbooks. An important system within these new institutions was the PISA system, which was designed to produce more copies of texts at a faster rate while also avoiding any corruption or mistake of the text. If a student requested a text to be copied, the exemplar copy would be distributed in quires or pieces to several copyists rather than in its whole to a single scribe. And this would allow a more efficient production rate of the copy since multiple scribes would be working on the same text at the same time. A second reason for manuscript production moving away from the church relates to the supply of paper. One reason that manuscript production was so expensive was due to the surfaces that were being written on. Parchment and vellum, which were animal skins. Historian Andrew Pettigrew found that an average-sized codex from the medieval period used the skins of anywhere from 20 to 40 animals, and that number doesn't even consider the large folio codices, more on that later, that were also being produced. But on the other hand, paper, which was made from used textiles till the 19th century, was much cheaper to produce than parchment or vellum. Paper manufacturing in Europe first began in Spain, but by the 13th century it had spread to Italy and Germany. And since there was an overabundance of used textiles, especially in comparison to animal skins, paper was not only cheaper to produce, but just more available. So both the rise of universities and the increasing availability of paper in the late Middle Ages led to rising urban literacy and, in turn, an increasingly commercial manuscript industry. The reading population was growing, which meant that books gained the ability to identify the social status of the author, reader, and seller. So, for example, Vespasiano de Bisticci, who was a 15th century manuscript bookseller in Florence, used the newly commercial book market to his benefit. As his career took off and he was able to attract clients such as the Duke of Urbino and Lorenzo de' Medici, Bisticci paid particular care to the quality and luxury of his manuscripts for his high-profile clientele, which would in turn aid his reputation as a book purveyor. So it was that Johann Gutenberg of Mainz invented the movable type printing press in the 1440s. It's important to note that the first printing press was invented by the Chinese Tang dynasty in the 6th century. The major difference between the Tang press and Gutenberg's is that the first press employed block printing, where an entire wooden block would be carved with the text and then printed onto a surface. Gutenberg's press, on the other hand, employed movable type using metal, which allowed isolated characters to be assembled to form the desired text. And this allowed text to be printed much faster than block printing. There were 3 major roles within the printing process. First, the typecaster would be responsible for assembling the letters and characters on the metal frame to accurately resemble what it was that needed to be printed. Out of the 3 roles, the typecaster would have needed to be the most educated, as they were responsible for the content of the printed text. They would have needed, at least ideally, a thorough knowledge of language and grammar to limit the number of errors in the final printed product. Second, the inker was responsible for distributing the ink on the metal frame with the characters. This role required patience, as it was crucial that the ink was distributed evenly among the frame. So to do this, the inker would take 2 ink balls or paddles, dip them in ink, rub the paddles together to ensure an even distribution of ink, and then stamp them simultaneously on the metal frame. And finally, the operator had to be the physically strongest of the trio. He would secure the paper into the carriage, lower it beneath the platen, pull the lever to lower the platen onto the paper, and then the platen pushes the paper up against the metal frame with the ink. The page is then hung up to dry, and the process is once again repeated on the other side of the page. So this printing trio was able to produce up to 3,600 pages per day, which is in sharp contrast to the mere 200 lines that monastic scribes were able to produce, as we talked about earlier. Fun fact, or maybe scary fact, depending on how you look at it, today's industrial presses can print up to 300 pages per minute. Yes, I said that right. So there are several important and just plain cool features to note about printed books within the first 50 years of the press, which are known as incunabula, or Latin for place of birth. So first, there were 3 sizes that early printed books came in. First is the folio. This was the largest of the 3 sizes, where 1 sheet of paper was folded down the center to create 2 leaves of paper. Gutenberg printed his famous Bibles in this size. Second, we have the quarto, where 1 sheet of paper is folded into 4 leaves. And finally, we have the octavo. This is my favorite, where 1 piece of paper is folded into 8 leaves. Printed books in this size took the shortest amount of time to produce and were therefore the cheapest, so early printers typically reserved this size for mass-produced classics, as they would be the most accessible and available to the public. Despite the printing press being inherently opposite from the work of scribes, on several counts, incunabula may be described almost as a hybrid between manuscript and print. Early printers were very aware of the manuscript market that they had interrupted, and therefore sought to mirror their prints after manuscripts in an attempt to attract those manuscript consumers. Although the list of parallels between manuscripts and incunabula is extensive and very, very interesting, 4 of these parallels are particularly prominent, in my opinion. So the first is marginalia. Early printers deliberately left space surrounding the text so that the reader could contribute to the text with their own annotations and thoughts. Second, typographical fonts were seemingly and intentionally identical to the calligraphy of scribes. One of the most famous of these fonts is Gutenberg's Textura, which is a form of Gothic script. Third is illumination. Although printing presses would eventually come to employ woodcut illustrations, early presses sought to replicate the lavish features of a beautifully illuminated manuscript, but with a mechanized process that proved to be pretty difficult and just really expensive. So early printers quickly understood the cost of these slow processes and began to employ illuminators that would, by hand, add the final touches to the manuscript. And lastly, Incunabula kept the incipit of manuscripts. So rather than having a separate title page and a separate page where the text actually begins, the incipit page, you can see on the right up here, would have the title of the text and the author at the top of the page, and the text would commence directly under it. Briefly, here is just a fantastic quantification of just how fast books blew up. As I said, Incunabula referred to books printed within the very first 50 years of printing. So you can see on the top line, the printing press of Gutenberg was established in Germany, so they started out. But looking at how many presses there were in Italy is really, really interesting. You can see their numbers increasing at a faster rate than the other countries here in this graph, or chart, whatever. So it was in about 1455, the very first European book was printed with movable type. It was a Latin grammar booklet called the Ars Minor by Aelius Donatus that was originally composed in the 4th century AD. Unfortunately, we only know of about 60 copies of this booklet to survive, but alas, just as history would have it, none of these surviving copies are complete. The second text to be printed was the infamous Gutenberg's Bible. Of the 180 Bibles that Gutenberg produced, only 48 of them survive to today. And of those 48 copies, 12 are printed on vellum, 36 are printed on paper, and only 21 of them are complete. So this is when I asked the class if anyone could guess what language the Bibles were printed in. The answer was Latin, so they could be used by the church or literate Christians. And for bonus points, who produced the Bible that Gutenberg copied from to produce his? The answer is St. Jerome. He produced the Latin Vulgate also in the 4th century. So these Bibles really were and are quite remarkable. They were printed in the large folio size in 42-line columns. They had no page numbers, no title page, or really any features that could distinguish it from a manuscript. And several of them even employed illumination, which, as mentioned, were manually added by artists after the printed text had dried. So, if you ever find yourself in Egypt, you can go to the Modern Library of Alexandria and see one of these Bibles. I took the photo here on the right. I was lucky enough to see it over the summer of 2022. If you'd rather stay local, the US owns 11 of these Bibles. I saw my second Gutenberg Bible at the J.P. Morgan Library in New York City. They have 3 Bibles, but I think only one of them on display. But I would highly recommend. It may or may not be a surprise to you that neither of these first 2 printed texts were particularly popular among the masses. It's common and generally accurate to associate the press with a major influx of books into the market. However, an essential feature of the press was its ability to mass-produce single-page documents and shorter tracts, which were much more available to the public than, say, the massive Gutenberg Bibles. So some examples of these materials include indulgences, recipes, grammar booklets, bureaucratic forms, calendars, playing cards, posters, devotionals, single-page images, almanacs, and eventually news stories. In comparison to printing the lengthy and detailed books, these commodities took far less time to produce and reached a wider public, which would ultimately make the printers more money. So, upon realizing this, our beloved Gutenberg, who was in severe debt, once stopped in the middle of producing one of his famous folio Bibles, quite literally the middle of it, when he was commissioned to print an order of 2,000 indulgences. And just a quick note here, I don't talk about it in this lecture, but the interaction between the press and the 16th century Reformation is fascinating. I would absolutely recommend Mark Edwards' book titled Printing, Propaganda, and Martin Luther. You won't regret it. Our Gutenberg died in 1468, just about 70 years old. By the year 1500, just 45 years after the first Gutenberg Bible was printed, there were an estimated 1,000 presses operating throughout Europe. There had been at least 8 million books printed by this time, the incunabula, but remember, this number doesn't even include the single-page documents we just talked about. It didn't take long for Gutenberg's press to take root outside of Germany. In 1470, Niccolò Perotti, a Latin grammarian who lived in Florence, wrote to a cardinal that he was immediately attracted to, quote, the new art of writing lately brought to us from Germany, end quote. Just 1 year later, the very first printing press was established in Florence, which would eventually produce the very first printed versions of the Iliad and Odyssey in 1488. The majority of the first presses outside of Germany, but especially in Italy, were established as church presses. For example, the very first printing press in Italy was the Subiaco Press, which was founded by 2 monks in 1465 and housed in a monastery. Despite the religious sponsoring of the early Italian presses, the industry was quickly commercialized, and early printers established full-blown businesses. As the printed book became a commodity, booksellers sought out the needs of their customers and adapted the products to fit those needs. Sound familiar? So, plainly put, the early printers were responding to consumer demand. This explains the movement away from religious texts and towards the single-page documents and mass-produced classics. For example, if we return to the Subiaco Press, which, once again, located in a monastery, we can see the quick expansion of the book market, along with didactic religious texts, a secular Latin grammar booklet, as well as Cicero's De Oratore were among the very first texts printed there. In this competitive and quickly expanding industry, early printed booksellers aspired to distinguish their products within the increasingly saturated market. And one way they could do this was through their printer's marks, which you might think of as the literary trademarks. Here's what they look like today. I know y'all recognize these. I got these in 2022, so they might be a little bit different now, but Penguin, Macmillan, Simon & Schuster, I know y'all recognize these. And here is what these printing marks looked like during the days of the first printing presses. Way cooler. I think we can all agree on that. So starting from the left, we have the mark of Aldus Manutius, who was a Venetian printer I'll be speaking on more in just a moment. But his mark is a dolphin wrapped around an anchor, and this is meant to be an ode to the Latin adage festina lente, which means make haste slowly, and is a quote attributed to Augustus. And in the middle, we have the printing mark of Johann Froben, who was a printer from Basel, and his mark is an allusion to the phrase in the Gospel of Matthew saying, "Be as wise as serpents, be as harmless as doves." And finally, on the right is the printer's mark of Valentin Fernandez, who was a printer from Portugal, and his mark is a crowned lion wearing a shield, which is bearing his initials. As I mentioned, it would be impossible to have any meaningful conversation about early European printing without talking about Aldus Manutius. A humanist and scholar himself, Manutius founded the most successful printing house in Venice, the Aldine Press, in 1491. Manutius quickly differentiated himself from other printers in that he was among the first to publish printed versions of the Greek and Latin classics, including works by Horace, Aristotle, Sophocles, Herodotus, Thucydides, Lucretius, Livy, the list goes on. His humanist education and knowledge of Latin and Greek allowed him to personally translate these texts into the vernacular, as well as translate or correct translations by others. He would publish many of these editions in that octavo size we were talking about, making it more affordable and accessible to the masses. And not only did he popularize the classics, but he also published contemporary vernacular works as well. He published works by Angelo Poliziano, Niccolò Perotti, and most importantly, Desiderius Erasmus. It is very important to observe the connection between Aldus Manutius and Erasmus. In 1507, Erasmus stayed for a visit at the Aldine Press, which by this point had evolved into what one historian called, quote, a mixture of the sweatshop, the boarding house, and the research institute, end quote. Oh my God, sign me up. But anyways, for the next 9 or so months, Erasmus worked on his adages while staying at the Aldine Press. The adages were a selection of over 3,000 Greek and Latin proverbs, which Erasmus then expanded on, even writing full essays on some of them. In 1508, the first edition of this work was published by Minucius and was just an instant classic, instant bestseller or whatever. The book was a compilation rather than one large stream of text, which was largely reminiscent of the medieval Florilegia format. And his adages are truly one of my favorite historical books ever. If you're looking to get yourself a copy, I'd highly recommend. There's several translations online, but I highly recommend Margaret Mann Phillips' translation of his adages. Here on the screen is one selection from the adage titled Festina Lente, after Aldus's printing mark, that reads the following in reference to Minucius. But the man who sets fallen learning on its feet, and this is almost more difficult than to originate it in the first place, is building up a sacred and immortal thing, and serving not one province alone, but all peoples and all generations. Once this was the task of princes, and it was the greatest glory of Ptolemy. But his library was contained between the narrow walls of its own house, and Aldus is building up a library which has no other limits than the world itself. I just think this is beautiful, but ironically, what follows this praise of Aldus is a sharp criticism of printing presses, where Erasmus just loathed the corruption of texts and the contamination of the market made possible by the printing press. But that is a story for a different day. There's a lot to unpack there. But after the original publication in 1508, Erasmus produced some 27 other editions of the adages with other various European printers. These editions eventually added over 1,000 more proverbs, and the complete text was some 1,000 pages long. Its initial popularity was instrumental in furthering Erasmus's status as a intellectual celebrity, if you will, but that in turn solidified the reputation of the Aldine Press. To close out today's conversation, there are at least 5 other legacies of the press that deserve to be considered. Number 1, the speed of production and increased accessibility that the press provided allowed for new forms of written communication, whether personal or administrative, to be developed or brought into mainstream society. An especially famous example of this are the essays of Michel de Montaigne, a French scholar and philosopher who lived during the middle of the 16th century. Although his writing and personal insights are what made him so popular, the printing press is what allowed him to solidify essay writing as a literary genre. The knowledge explosion that the printing press spurred also led to the so-called Republic of Letters that took place during the Renaissance as well as the Enlightenment. Even though letter writing, of course, happened before Gutenberg's press, it encouraged a wave of letters between humanists and intellectuals and reformists across Europe. Number 2, a second legacy of the press is that it directly led to a larger reading public. It's really quite hard to say exactly how much Gutenberg's press increased literacy in Europe, but estimates range from 5 to 20% increase in literacy following this invention. Regardless, the printing press allowed for a type of democratization of knowledge, as greater numbers of individuals were given access to a diverse selection of texts. As individuals were able to become more educated and interpret texts in their own way, they were able to develop previously untouched or silent ideas that were viewed as radical. And an example of one of these individuals is Martin Luther. He used print to his benefit to widely share his ideology and claimed that, quote, printing is the ultimate gift of God, end quote. Number 3, in a similar vein, the printing press promoted the accumulation of human capital, or stuff. After only 50 years of printing, there were some 8 to 9 million books, the Incunabula, in circulation. And once again, that doesn't even include the number of single-page documents and pamphlets that the press also provided. Just a lot of stuff. So a material effect of the printing press was the steady injection of more texts, products, and ideas into society, which was a stark change from the conservative output of manuscripts. An overabundance of anything can be intoxicating, especially when more remains unknown than known. There are a number of ambivalent and even ambiguous responses to print that cite the corruption of texts, greedy booksellers, and the overshadowing of classical texts. They were all just responding to a newfound abundance of information with which they did not know what to do. I'll spare you all and won't go on a soapbox here, at least right now, but I would argue that this theme of an overwhelming amount of stimuli is still very, very, if not way more present in our own age. Number 4. So far, I seriously hope that I've not communicated the idea to you that the printing press just eradicated manuscript production, as a fourth legacy of the press is, ironically, the perseverance of manuscripts. In no way was the printing press a technology wholly independent from manuscripts. Print and manuscript were permanently intertwined, and it could be argued that neither would exist without the other. While the printing press did replace some scribal practices, it also introduced new communication and information forms that were meant to be written on. Peter Stallybrass, a cultural historian, even went so far as to say that, quote, printing's most radical effects was the incitement of writing by hand, end quote. A majority of the printed single-page documents, such as those indulgences and records and etc., were printed so that they could be written on. And the diversity of these texts demonstrates the continued relevance of manuscripts in a print world and the undeniable relationship between these two practices. Earlier, we spoke about the marginalia that early books, and even some books from today, employed. By leaving space around the text empty, they were inviting readers to write something by hand. For this reason, as well as other characteristics of early books that were reminiscent of manuscripts, it was not until the late 17th century that the public began to conceive of manuscript and print as inherently different. So to say that the printing press replaced manuscripts would be a totally false assertion. Manuscript production did not vanish. Rather, it adapted to print. And finally, we started this lecture with historian Elizabeth Eisenstein, and it seems fitting to also end it with her. A last major legacy of the printing press is what Eisenstein termed the permanent Renaissance. Yes, that sounds kind of funny, doesn't it? Rebirth being permanent. But what Eisenstein was getting at here is that a direct and fixed line was established between the Renaissance and the classical past. The printing press brought back the life of antiquity to the Renaissance culture, but it also confirmed the preservation of the present. So the future, people like us right now, can establish a direct line with them. And I think this legacy is summed up very well by Polydore Vergil, a humanist from the 15th century, who said the following: "Books in all disciplines have poured out to us so profusely from this invention that no work can possibly remain wanting to anyone, however needy. Note, too, that this invention has freed most authors, Greek as well as Latin, from any threat of extinction." Oh my gosh, my voice hurts. If you've made it to the end of this, wow, thank you so much. I hope you learned something and maybe even enjoyed it a little bit. But here's that bibliography that I was talking about. I know it's kind of awkward, the setting I got it in. I just screen recorded the bibliography of an article that I had published a few years back. Not every single source in this bibliography was used in the making of this lecture, but I couldn't recommend it more enough. I will leave a link to my own personal article that was published in the description if you're interested. But if you're looking to get into and learn more about book history, there's a few essentials. I'm thinking of Elizabeth Eisenstein, rest in peace. I'm thinking of Adrian Johns. I'm thinking of Andrew Pettigrew. I think all three of those scholars are a fantastic place to start. And going a bit broader than that, I have to explicitly recommend Dr. Paul Dover's book from Cambridge titled The Information Revolution in Early Modern Europe. Dr. Dover is my professional mentor throughout college. He is the professor under which I gave this lecture to his Renaissance history course. I have learned everything I know from him, and he is an absolute superstar in the fields of diplomatic Renaissance history and information history at large. So definitely recommend him. And that's kind of all I have for now. I would like to post some other lectures I have that are within the same realm of this topic, but also some things that are a bit different. Yeah, I guess I really don't have anything else to say. Thank you again for being here. If you want to, challenge me on any of this, or if you have any questions, please let's talk below. There's not many people I know that I can nerd out about this stuff with, so I really would be grateful for the opportunity to talk with some strangers about it. So that's all I got. Thank you for being here and have a fantastic day.